I find Paul's first letter to the Corinthians especially challenging for a university, in that he continually ridicules those Corinthians who believe that their intelligence will actually save them. Gnosticism was a prevalent heresy that Paul tackles throughout his ministry, namely the concept that intelligence can save us, that it alone gives us admittance to holy understandings, and that knowledge or new understanding can be used to separate believers. We cannot forget that 1 Corinthians is a personal letter from one human to a bunch of other humans about really human stuff. And I cannot help but take this letter personally. I think that's the point. So here's my life and my struggle with 1 Corinthians 8. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Growing up, I was never categorized, labeled, or called smart. If you asked my friends and family to describe me, I bet that they would not highlight my intelligence. That's just not what would come first. My family and friends focused on my character. I was called kind, enthusiastic, positive, personable, lively, compassionate, maybe sometimes funny, but never smart. Next slide. In elementary school, I remember that reading groups were organized by color. And it did not take a genius to figure out that there was a correlation between the bright colors and the best readers. So the red group and the yellow group were occupied by readers who were way above grade level. I think I was in the taupe group. Next slide. That's taupe. In junior high school, next slide, I was inducted into the National Junior Honor Society. And I'm convinced that I was inducted into the National Junior Honor Society because my father, a local pastor and community leader, was invited to be the keynote speaker at that convocation ceremony. He denies this, as a good father would, but I remember having a meeting with the advisor of the National Junior Honor Society and two of my friends who were on the National Junior Honor Society cabinet. It was clear that I met just one of the 5 criteria for induction: good character. The advisor said that I was pretty close on 2 other criteria: service and leadership, which meant that I sort of met 3 of the 5 criteria, which I guess was good enough for her. Next slide. I still have my membership card. That's supposed to be sad. In high school, next slide, a friend of mine and I decided to throw a party with all of our friends to celebrate the fact that 2 of us had tied for 91st in our class, in our graduating class. And I won't tell you how many graduated that year. Next slide. In college, I remember sitting in one of my favorite literature courses taught by my favorite English professor. In the middle of class, the chair of the department poked his head in and said, "Hey, Dr. Walters, you got any good students in here?" Dr. Walters responded, "Yes, look, there's Renee, and we've got Emily over there." And Jake, he looked right at me, next slide, and said, "Jake wears the coolest t-shirts." That's actually a really great t-shirt of Tony the Tiger on Frosted Flakes. I start by telling you all these stories, and there are many more, because as an adult, I have desired nothing more than for people to think that I'm smart. Honestly, there are times when I cringe when people comment on my character and disregard my intellect. I want to be recognized by the academy, my peers, my administrators, and my students as intelligent, brilliant, a walking brain, smart. The other stuff, kindness, compassion, encouragement, is for Sunday school teachers and kids soccer coaches, not professors. We are smart. So you can imagine the level of depression that I felt when 4 of my 5 top signature themes, according to the Strengths Quest personality assessment, were outside of the strategic thinking category. Next slide. Positivity, you are generous with praise, quick to smile, and always on the lookout for the positive in a situation. Restorative, you enjoy the challenge of analyzing the symptoms, identifying what is wrong, and finding the solution. Developer, you see the potential in others, and the worst, woo, winning others over. You enjoy the challenge of meeting new people and getting them to like you. When I first read this, I thought, I should just get a job where I hug people all day long and tell them how great they are. Not a serious academic who teaches and publishes and travels to conferences and talks about really important, serious things. These feelings of intellectual inadequacy and inferiority all came to a head for me in a department meeting just last year. We were all at the tail end of a very important faculty search, and there were many differing opinions among administration, the committee, and department faculty. As the head of the department and chair of the search, I asked that the search committee, administration, and the department meet to pray and to discuss a potentially tense situation as we narrowed our top 3 picks down to the final candidate. And it seemed that the administration favored one candidate while the department favored another. And even the department wasn't exactly in total agreement. In this meeting, part of the conversation revolved around differing types of professors, those who are more relational and those who are more intellectual. One member of the meeting said that it was clear why the department favored the second candidate because she seemed much more relational, like Jake. Yet she did not have the high quality of mind, read, like Jake, like the other candidate. I was crushed. I felt insulted, annoyed, and ridiculed. Again, I wasn't smart enough. Being kind was not as good as being smart. I spent the rest of the day stewing over that comment. I also spent that day recalling all the times in my life where I felt stupid, unprepared, and outsmarted. I reread my resume. Look, I said to myself in anger, I've published a peer review article each year I've been here. Look, I've edited 2 books. Look, I have presented a conference paper once or twice each calendar year since graduate school. Look, 2 of those conference papers won awards. Look, 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 I am smart. I am smart. I'm not just nice and fun and pleasant and encouraging and easy to work with and nice and nice and nice. Here were my dilemmas. First, I bought into the false dichotomy that a high quality of mind, IQ, and a high quality of emotions, EQ, sit stubbornly on opposite sides, never to meet. Yes, we do know very smart people who cannot relate to humans with any sense of decorum. And yes, we know very kind people that have cognitive disabilities and intellectual difficulties. Yet the majority of us live in this middle place where we value our intelligence and our relational skills. We are both smart and kind. And secondly, I had to ask myself why it hurt my feelings so badly to be placed in the relational camp. I had to come to grips with a lot of baggage about intelligence and success and identity. And all of this tension came to a head for me while reading and rereading and rereading 1 Corinthians 8. Paul writes, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, and love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God. Next slide, please. Perfect. Now listen to how Eugene Peterson in The Message paraphrases. We sometimes tend to think we know all we need to know to answer these kinds of questions. But sometimes our humble hearts can help us more than our proud minds. We never really know enough until we recognize that God alone knows it all. Paul is writing about a particular church problem in Corinth, and even to a particular heresy within the Christian community of Corinth. There was a debate about whether Christians should eat meat that had been sacrificed to an idol in the local temples. Some Christians were bothered about the fact that the meat they ate had prior pagan purposes. And this was no easy avoidance, as this type of meat was sold at the market and served at many social gatherings. A God-fearing Christian could not avoid idol sacrifice meat. This was a big deal. Now, many Christians knew, the Greek here is gnosis, an intellectual grasp of something, that there was no such thing as idols, so they had no problem eating meat anywhere and in front of anybody. Paul agreed with them in theory. Next slide. The second clause in verse 4 reads, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world and that there is no God but one. He acknowledges the importance of knowledge, of better understanding the Creator and the created world through intellect. Paul is not anti-intellectual. Romans stumps me every time. Yet he was angry at how these knowledgeable Corinthian Christians used this knowledge. They became arrogant and showy. What is worse than just being swollen-headed, as Calvin writes, is that this knowledge had no compassion or love for the weaker Christian brother whose conscience was quite bothered by this issue. Next slide. In verse 7, Paul chastises these believers. But not everyone knows this. And in verse 9, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom, your knowledge, does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Next slide, please. Thanks. Again, listen to how the Message paraphrases this passage. In strict logic, then, nothing happened to the meat when it was offered up to an idol. It's just like any other meat. I know that, and you know that. But knowing isn't everything. If it becomes everything, some people end up as know-it-alls, who treat others as know-nothings. Real knowledge isn't that insensitive. Paul's point was and is clear. It's good to be smart. But if our intelligence has no love or compassion for those around us, and if our intelligence does not acknowledge with humility a creator who has gifted us with this knowledge, or has gifted us the particular subject of study, then not only are we sinning against our brother or sister with our arrogance and ignorance, we are also sinning against Christ. This was a very hard pill for me to swallow, because I had to admit that my knowledge and my search for knowledge had sometimes been used simply to feed my ego, impress others around me, or at least to fill some emotional gap, real or perceived, from my childhood. For example, on that day that I read and reread my resume, I confessed to myself that there were several published articles and presented conference papers that I cared very little about. That the sole reason for seeking publication was to see my name in print and to increase the size of my resume. This is not the life of the mind that we are called to live. Here's my big question for all of us. What good then is knowledge if it is not used to build up, to edify, to construct, and strengthen? It seems to me that Paul, in this passage, destroys the false dichotomy that caused me so much pain in that department meeting. Not only is it possible to maintain knowledge and love relationships, but it is an essential part of the faith. According to Paul, a bit later in chapter 13, in America it seems like 1 Corinthians 13 is only good for weddings. I think it's good for all of our relationships, even textbooks. If I do all of these things, these smart things, these academic things that I desire without love, then I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. This new knowledge, after studying this chapter, helped me begin to understand that knowledge will not save me. I cannot earn grace through my intelligence, and knowledge will not save me from my own emotional issues regarding intelligence or my past. What I have to do then is reconstruct the purpose of knowledge as a part of my Christian response to God's grace. And I'd like today to propose an alternative, a way of thinking about knowledge that does not isolate itself from love. All truth is God's truth, as St. Augustine tells us in his short but powerful book on Christian teaching. Therefore, anytime we learn anything that we call truth, as the Holy Spirit aids us, we know more about what God has made, which means that we have the opportunity to know more about God's character. Therefore, if this is true, then knowledge becomes part of an intimate relationship between us and the created world, and ultimately between us and the sovereign God who created it. Knowledge is relationship. It is a place where we participate in God's kingdom. So then why do some of us attempt to own knowledge? Why do we turn a wonderful word like curiosity into a vice that in Latin was called curiositas? Appetite for the ownership of new knowledge. In my desire to know more things in order to be categorized as smart, I tried to, in the words of theologian and the author of The Vice of Curiosity, Paul J. Griffiths, stay right there, establish a relation of dominance over it by making it exclusively mine. In other words, my fear is that this type of knowledge carries with it this definition: one who wants to know only so that one may speak of what one knows. As Paul writes, knowledge puffs up. Griffiths really speaks to my early version of knowledge when he says, to seek to know something idolatrously is to seek to know it as if it could be known and enjoyed solely in terms of itself, without reference to the God who called it into being and sustains it in being. And this is why I've become more and more critical of the term learning for learning's sake. It's a popular phrase that many of us have used with good intentions to keep students or ourselves from either overemphasizing grades and external rewards, or on the opposite side, believing knowledge is only good if one can do something practical with it, job training. We professors have to battle these ideas often and furiously, so we use phrases like intrinsic value or learning for learning's sake as our weapons. But if we believe that God is the creator of all things and the knower of all things, then any truth we learn is for God's sake, that my learning is a form of worship that further connects me to my Creator and to the things my God has created. Our learning turns from idolatrous to iconic. What we learn becomes the window to see God more clearly. The Old Testament uses the term know to refer to sexual relationships. To know someone in the ancient world was to be connected with them intimately, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. What would happen if our definition or use of knowledge turned from grasping, the term Paul used to describe the arrogant Christians who knew more than the others, to intimacy? Knowledge is a deeper, more connected relationship with the creator of all knowledge. In conclusion, here's a practical tip that may help you to anoint or baptize your learning and keep you from cannibalizing learning for its own sake. Pray. And I don't mean this to be the easy Sunday school answer. I've had people in my life tell me to pray simply because they didn't want to deal with the issue at hand. I don't mean pray in that way. And there are also some in the academy who believe that praying is too anti-intellectual. So if Christian intellects are to be taken seriously, then prayer should not be a part of the academic life. Next slide, please. Griffiths challenges this type of thinking when he recommends to forget to pray before we study is to forget to acknowledge what it is that we're doing, and very likely thereby to tend toward the curious desire for mastery rather than the studious desire for intimacy. If we believe that God has created all things, and God has created us to know Him better and enjoy Him forever, then prayer becomes that worshipful time to remind us of this truth. We recognize that this is, next slide please, as Griffith says, our appropriate relation with the Lord as the one who gives wisdom, without which understanding is not possible. Or not. I believe I'm coming out of a dark place that puts intelligence above all other strengths. And I believe Paul's words and the work of my theologians are helping me understand the true relationship between love and learning, between intimacy and knowledge. The problem that Paul addresses in chapter 8 is that these Corinthians believe too strenuously and too vigorously and too ignorantly in their own ability to grasp something intellectually. In verse 9, Paul writes, "Be careful that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak." In other words, be careful that your intelligence could actually get in the way of your relationships with others, even with God. Again, do not hear me saying that intelligence is bad. I'm a professor with degrees. Their knowledge hurt people, and it did not edify others or their God. Additionally, I don't believe it edified them. I think it left them empty. Next slide, please. And next slide. And I went through that. I would like for you to talk to each other now. I believe this is a problem with my university students back home. And I know I've been here 8 months, but I have many conversations with you. And I think this is something that Handong students struggle with as well. Am I talking with you? What is your definition of knowledge? And how is that definition of knowledge connected to your definition of love? And how are they both part of being university students? I'm very interested in you talking with each other now and sharing some ideas that you might have. So please, spend a few minutes, find the person next to you, and start discussing. Share your stories. Okay, let's stop for a minute. This might be a little out of the ordinary, but I would love it if someone were brave enough to share an idea. Yes.
Well, thank you guys for wanting me to come. Okay, what I'd like to mention is, I don't know if you've heard of objective knowledge versus subjective knowledge. But like, for example, we know the sky is blue, right? But does the sky being blue, does that help or does that hurt anybody? Right, so that's objective knowledge, like 2 + 2 is 4. It doesn't really help, it doesn't hurt. However, I would like to suggest, this is my opinion, that the kind of knowledge that we have in Corinthians, that Paul's talking about, is the subjective knowledge. Knowledge that that not everyone agrees on. So if you learn theology, religion, philosophy, that kind of stuff, we can use that as a weapon to tear down those around us, or we can use it to glorify God. And I believe, is that what the summary of the sermon is how do we use that knowledge? Or I guess that's the definition of wisdom, right? Wisdom, knowledge is a bunch of facts. Wisdom is what you do or how you apply that knowledge. You can have bad wisdom or good wisdom. Ultimately, God has perfect wisdom. So I would like to, just if you walk away with that, don't think that knowing like chemistry or science is innately bad. It's not going to, hurt you as long as you're not going to use it as a weapon. Does that make sense? I know there was a lot of high-level English, and it may have been hard to understand. So if that helps, 감사합니다.
And I appreciate that. Even for I was just thinking about this, even for maybe the objective knowledge. Why are we learning it in the first place? And this is where the curiositas as a vice is really interesting. How many of you, well, I'm not going to out you, but I love little trivia facts. Why do I know these facts? Why do I know more about American baseball than I do about the Bible? Why do I know all these little things? What good does that do me? How do we treat the objective facts? Am I learning simply to memorize things in order to do well on a test? And believe me, if this is our definition of knowledge, it will leave us empty and it will leave us cold. But when we learn, when we pay attention, when we learn and we study, and we really believe that our studying will actually help us learn more about the Creator, I believe that is biblical knowledge. That's what we're doing. And it changes our relationships. It changes our relationship to knowledge. So I agree with you, Marcos, but I think that objective knowledge is still there too. How are we even paying attention to that? Anybody else want to share an experience or a thought? Or ask me a question? Okay.
So I'm currently taking Professor Stratman's class, reading and reflecting from Great Mind. And one thing we talked about during the creation part was that everything comes from God. And one question that I always had was, I'm a life science major student, and I always thought that science is different, always on separate sides with like the Bible. Because we always fight because the Bible says this is right, or scientists say that, well, science proves this, so this is wrong. But I think that since every knowledge, all things were created by God and comes from God, I think that we should try to integrate everything that we learn, like sometimes psychology, or I think that's what Handong is trying to do. We're trying to integrate the Bible with the knowledge that we have. So I think we should try to think that knowledge and the Bible are different things, but maybe we should try to think of it as one.
And what I appreciate about him bringing up that kind of debate is I think we've all seen real ugliness with that. I think we've seen lots of people who have lots of intelligence about science and faith and origins and where ugliness has come from that, how we've used that knowledge. I think it's actually a great example. I want to pray for you. Can I pray? Actually, I don't know why I said that. I don't like praying in public. All right. This is my prayer for you during midterm week. God, we do praise you. We praise you and we lift you above all things. That you are the source of knowledge. And that you give us these gifts. You give us the gift of study. You give us the gift of this university. You give us the privilege to get an education where many in the world do not have that privilege. God, we ask through our studies that you provide us the wisdom to seek you out in all things. To recognize that you are the giver of knowledge. To recognize how we can use that to expand your kingdom. to bring others to you. And I ask special prayers for these students today as some, I believe, are completely stressed out in ways that are just not healthy or even biblical. And I pray that you can help us all have a better understanding of why we're here, why you've placed us here, and why you've given us the knowledge you've given us. And I pray this genuinely, I pray this sincerely for all of our students. Amen.